Hi, I'm Karin Wulf. I'm the director and librarian at the John Carter Brown Library here, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the JCB for this event hosted in partnership with Brown 2026. As a library devoted to the early Americas, since the middle of the 19th century, the JCB's collections have been developed to address questions about this essential place and period, in so many respects, the very foundation of the modern world. The JCB welcomes researchers from our campus home here at Brown and from all over the globe to think through the multidimensional peril and promise, vigor and violence of the world made by colonialism. So as we gather in this beautiful reading room, I want to note two things in particular. First, how very grateful we are for all who support the JCB's work and the work of research and knowledge making here. And second, how much events like this contribute to the intellectual community that makes that knowledge manifest. It is a special pleasure for me to get to introduce Gordon Wood, the Alva Way University professor and professor of history emeritus here at Brown. There aren't that many people, honestly, that you can say they don't need an introduction. People say that all the time. It's not always very true. But in this case, it is actually true. Gordon's scholarship has been so lauded and so awarded, including with a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, and a National Humanities Medal from President Barack Obama. Though closer to home, I also want to note that Gordon was awarded a JCB medal, I think, that same year. So, you know, National Humanities from the president, JCB from here, from the director. But tonight we're here principally to talk about the creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, published in 1969 by the Omohundro Institute and Norton, winner of the Bancroft Prize, and a book that so many people describe as a tour de force, and more than 50 years later, as a must-read. Gordon joined the faculty at Brown, I want to note, that same year that this book was published. This event is a partner project between the JCB's own 2026 and Beyond project and Brown University's Brown 2026 initiative to mark the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, to think deeply about the role of the research university in and for democracy, and the histories and legacies of the American Revolution. And obviously, a conversation with Gordon is remarkably fitting. So a few words about format here. First, you'll notice that we have about a dozen copies here of Creation, not counting my own, which is on the table. And we've devised a bit of a raffle. I think my colleagues have shared raffle tickets with those of you who are interested, and we will draw tickets for those of you lucky enough to take one home. Secondly, I'm going to have the pleasure of a conversation with Gordon, and after about 40 minutes, we'll open it up to all of you. And last, afterwards, of course, we'll have a nice reception and we can continue our conversation with a bit of food and beverage. And as always, a special thank you to the terrific JCB staff for having organized all of this. Hey, Kate, can we have a bottle of water for us? Thanks. Cool. So, Gordon, I gave you, I already chatted a bit about my dog-eared copy of Creation and my experience of reading this. As I was preparing for this conversation, I noticed that among the many times you have talked about the Constitution here at Brown, there was, for example, in 2005, a kind of series on the Constitution, lectures or so on. And, you know, I can't imagine how many times you've talked about the Constitution here, around the country, around the world. So I guess my first question is, are there moments where this like crests and falls again? Or has it just been like constant? Gordon, talk about the Constitution like from 1969 publication to now.
Well, the reason, 2005, the federal government mandated that we have celebrations throughout the academic world on September 17th or as close to that as possible, and that's been kept up ever since. That's what led to my lecture then. The president called me and said, "You've got to give a lecture because we're under pressure from the federal government." But I think the Constitution obviously is such a important part of our lives that it's not surprising that it would be talked about all the time, not only by academics, but of course by lawyers, by the law professors, and judges and jurists of all sorts. So the Constitution is at the center of our lives, and we're finding it more and more important even every day.
Literally every day. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I know we're going to talk about 2026 maybe later in our conversation, but do anniversaries play a role here? I know, there were forums around the kind of, anniversary of the convention in 87. Do
Right.
anniversaries, is that a big deal, you think, too?
Well, I know I gave a lot of lectures. I went through two bicentennials, the bicentennial of 1776 and then the bicentennial of the Constitution. And now we're coming up to 250th. I'm not sure we're going to make the Constitution 250th, but that's another 10 years away. But as Thomas Paine said, he lived through two revolutions. He thought that was quite an accomplishment. Two bicentennials. Look, it's a time for celebration, for thinking about your polity, your government, and it's a natural thing to do. I don't think that the celebrations work out quite as well as the scholars or the academics expect, but I think there's a certain amount of popular interest. I'm not sure how the 250th here is going to, in this state. I think some states are really, Virginia has done very well, and Massachusetts seems to be doing fine, but I'm not sure that there's anything going on here in Rhode Island. Pat Conley is too old for that, I guess, and so he would have taken the lead.
I'm gonna leave that topic for the moment. I hope we'll come back to it, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this book and about your readers for this book. So I told you a little about my own story of reading it as an undergraduate and being totally gripped by it. I can remember sitting on my dorm room bed and reading this book over a weekend and giving up any thought I had of a different kind of career and thinking like history was it. It wasn't it. I was taking a really good class, that was having me read this book. Maybe I was a junior and not a sophomore, but I was an undergraduate. And you said, well, you didn't read it in graduate school. And of course I did read it in graduate school too. But since I've been thinking about this conversation with you, I saw Susan Juster, the director of research out at the Huntington Library, who was a Brown undergraduate. And Sue said to me that she had taken a course with you as a freshman, and she was completely in over her head. And she said it was amazing. But the book was transformational for her as an undergraduate. And then Jonathan Knapp, I saw recently, another fantastic scholar of the Constitution, said he read as an undergraduate. So I wonder, who are you thinking of, or who were you thinking of, and who are you thinking of now as the readers for this book?
I certainly wasn't thinking about my readership. This was my dissertation. I don't think academics think about their readership when they're writing the dissertation. As it turned out, it was picked up by graduate schools mostly. I can't believe that you read it as an undergraduate. No undergraduate today would read such a book. I mean, one chapter would be enough. That's it. But the graduate schools picked it up, and this republicanism became a fad. And like many academics, they're kind of like lemmings. They just picked it up, and we had republicanism everywhere. Republican mothers, Republican food. I mean, it became the thing that people wanted to exploit. And also, I think in the 1970s and 80s, Marxism was kind of in doubt, and people were looking for some alternative to Marxism that would get us out of our selfish capitalist individualism. And they found in the notion of republicanism, the public good, the res publica. Political scientists and especially law professors picked that up and ran with it and became a big deal through the 70s and 80s, way beyond anything that I could have anticipated or imagined. It's been written about Laura Kalman, who's a professor of law at one of the California's law schools, has written a book about this, the way the Republicanism took off. Then it got replaced by more recent race and gender issues. But for a while there, Republicanism was the answer to the plight of liberalism, I guess you'd say.
Can you say more about that? Like, why would people find Republicanism so compelling? Was there something about the political moment of that time, or do you think it was not?
No,
it wasn't. I mean, because you framed it as a historiographical kind of moment, and not a
academics
kind of contemporary
I
moment.
think academics have a kind of tension with liberalism, individualism, capitalism. Certainly, most academics don't like capitalism. And I think it seemed this was a homegrown notion. James Madison, Republicanism, they could use it and in ways that challenged the liberalism. The only book that I had read having to do with political theory before I wrote this was Louis Hartz's book about liberal America. And of course, Hartz hated liberal America. He writes about it, but he really disliked that world. And this seemed to be an alternative to that world, that individualistic world. I mean, the irony, of course, is that although I don't deal with it, is that by the early 19th century, the United States had become the most liberal, the most individualistic, the most capitalistic society in the world, despite its Republican res publica beginnings.
Did you think about that kind of historiographical back and forth with folks like Joyce Appleby wanting to write about the kind of liberal tradition? Like in graduate school, sometimes, it gets posed that way. Can you look at the liberal tradition and Appleby et al., look at the Republicanism tradition, Wood et al.? Did you think about that a lot?
No, not when I was writing it. I got to know Joyce later, of course, and her book came out much later. And she was defending it. She got away with that. I'm not sure how she did, defending liberalism. But no, I was not aware of any of that issue. I simply wanted to immerse myself in this distant past. And I just read everything between 1774 and 1778. I just read everything that I could read. And it was all available on the Charles Evans bibliography. And of course, everyone who works in the early America knows about that bibliography. It was letterpress edition, 12 volumes. 3 volumes take you up to 1765. 9 volumes, 9 to 12. 9 volumes from the 3rd to the 12th, from 1765 to 1800. It gives you an idea of the explosion of print. Evans tried to get a hold of every single pamphlet, book, anything that was printed in that period. And he had a few ghosts, but he was an extraordinary bibliographical endeavor. And I just took when I was working on the dissertation, Redex Corporation had printed everything on little cards, 100 pages on a sort of an 8x5 card, or maybe it was a little 10x6 card. And you would read, stick it in the machine and read. I spent more hours in these machines at Lamont Library at Harvard reading these, everything I could read. And that's what I came away with, was a sense that this was a world totally different from anything that I had heard about. I didn't realize that there was such a Republican world. So much talk of corruption, of luxury, so different from our world that I found it fascinating.
Okay, I'm going to resist skipping ahead and stick to my original plan here, but you'll see how we're going to come back to two of those themes, licentiousness and also historicism. But so one thing that struck me as I was reading some of the original reviews of the book, which was a great joy and very interesting, so just kind of anthropologically very interesting to read some of those reviews. And then there was an incredible forum in 1987 in the William & Mary Quarterly, where I think 12 different scholars talked about the book, and you responded. And then just recently, the New England Quarterly had a couple of scholars talk about creation at 50, like really interesting. But here's a phenomenon that was really snagged my attention. Different people located the center of the book in different places. Like some people really thought like the center of the book is like chapters 2 to 4. So that takes us from the Revolution to the Articles of Confederation, that first Constitution. And other people are like, no, it's about, when they're making the federal Constitution. First of all, where do you think the center of the book is, if there's a center? And has your thought about that changed?
I don't think there's any particular center. It's interesting. I mean, the first part of the book deals with republicanism, the revolution, the ideological debate that led to the Declaration of Independence. The center of the book deals with constitution making. I can only say that my mentor, Bud Balin, didn't like the last part because it suggested that there was a social conflict in the revolution, and he just wouldn't admit that. So when he assigned the book after it was published, he only assigned the middle chapters because he didn't want any suggestion that there was the worthy versus the licentious. So, but the middle stuff was all the Constitution. It just was fascinating to think about how do you. These people started with the premise that that government was established by estates. They were still thinking vaguely, but in terms of estates, like the third estate, the people. And in England, of course, that was the monarchy, the aristocracy in the House of Lords, and the people in the House of Commons. And the Americans wanted to duplicate that, only it was going to be a Republican version. They would have elected officials. What was fascinating, for example, to me was the efforts to design this Senate. How do you get the Senate? It looked like it was going to be elected. Well, it ended up having the same kinds of people that were in the House of Representatives. That was an awkward situation. They wanted the Senate to be like the House of Lords. It would be noble, wise people. But they ended up being the same kinds of politicians that were in the lower house. The efforts to make a Senate were fascinating. One of the most interesting parts for me in writing the book. Of course, Pennsylvania challenged the whole idea of balanced or mixed government and had no Senate and had no governor. They were going to be as democratic as you could be in 1776 by having just a single House of Representatives. They did appoint a committee that would act as an executive, but that was as close to a democracy as representative democracy as you could get in the eyes of people of 1776. How the book developed, I was going to write about state constitutions and how state constitution making, because I remember Balin in a lecture said there isn't much stuff done on this state constitution making. So I started with that, and I read everything surrounding the constitutions. There were no debates similar to what you had later with the federal constitution. The conventions were all private. Nobody published much about that, but there were pamphlets here and there. And then I said, well, I'm going to look at what did people say 10 years later in the debate over the Constitution, the federal Constitution. And when I immersed myself in those debates, I realized that the arguments were totally different. And there was my dissertation. How do you go from A to B? The change that took place in one decade was extraordinary. The whole world was turned upside down, intellectually, culturally. And that became my dissertation, that sort of...
That translation of new, fresh ideas to new structures is an amazing story in itself. And that transition from the Articles of Confederation, that first effort at a national constitution, to the federal constitution, that's very intense. For me, as I told you, the worthy against the licentious, that's the chapter that like owns the book, I think, because the energy is so intense there. Can you talk a little bit about, that's John Dickinson being his moralizing self when he talks about the worthy against the licentious. But can you talk about like that moral fervor and that kind of intensity, because I think sometimes we lose the fact that these guys were so intense about their beliefs.
Well, the crisis seems serious. The articles are, to understand those, it's not an early version of the Constitution. It would be a mistake to think about the Articles of Confederation. It's a treaty. It's like the EU. The states, these 13 independent states, came together and passed a treaty in which they finally all agreed. They didn't all agree until March of 1781. That's only 6 months before Yorktown, so it was a real problem getting them all to agree. When Jefferson talked about my country, he didn't mean the United States, he meant Virginia. And John Adams said my country, he meant Massachusetts. So we have to realize that they thought about their world the way most Europeans think about the EU. The EU scarcely exists in their mental. Europe is there, but it's France, it's Germany, it's Belgium, it's the Netherlands. And in the same way, Americans thought about their states. So how do you, and nobody, and I mean nobody in 1776, in their wildest dreams, thought about a strong federal government of the sort that emerged. It never even entered in anyone's mind. So something awful, really awful, had to happen in the decade to change people's minds. I mean, all theory was against it. Montesquieu said republics have to be small in size, homogeneous in character. Their experience with distant British government, why would they change their minds so dramatically? And that became my question. And in the end, and this is a controversy among historians, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they needed to change the Articles. Needed some amendments. It had no taxing power. It had no way of raising money. It couldn't even organize international trade. So those two amendments were clearly in everyone's mind by 1786, and everyone agreed. Everyone who in the political nation agreed that the amendments had to be added to the Articles. But James Madison and others had another agenda. What they really were frightened by is what came to be called democratic excesses in the state legislatures. The state legislatures, these representative bodies, sometimes 2 and 4 times the size of their colonial predecessors, were running wild, passing all kinds of legislation that was oppressive in the eyes of many elites. They didn't use the term elite, but that's what we would call them. Madison wrote a little essay in the spring of 1787 called The Vices of the System of the United States. It's a working paper. You can call it up on it's only a short, 10 pages or something. Call it up on your iPad and read it. And he focuses on state behavior, what he calls the multiplicity, the mutability, and finally, the injustice of state laws. And to him, this was the crisis, because this brought into question Republican government itself, which relies on majority rule. And he said, how are we going to deal with this? And that becomes his solution. He writes a Virginia plan. He consults with other Virginians and some other people. I think he consulted with Wilson in Pennsylvania and others. The Virginia plan is a total scrapping of the Articles and a totally new government, the kind of government we have, with a president and a Senate and a House that operates, and a judiciary that operates directly on the people. None of the states. It's just as if Europe today just bypassed the states and created a government that operated directly on the people of Europe. It's not going to happen, but it happened here. And Madison was frightened by the behavior of the states, in particular, in the printing of paper money. If you can believe it, that becomes the focus of his fear, because the paper money was hurting creditors. Now you have to understand how the gentry operated in the 18th century to make sense of this. I should back up. In England, about 400 families owned all of the land of England, or most of the land, and they rented it out on long-term leases and so on. And Adam Smith said, these landed aristocrats make the ideal political leaders because their income comes without exertion. That is to say, they aren't in the marketplace trying to make money. Smith said merchants, businessmen, could never be political leaders because they're too self-interested. It's impossible for them to think about anything but their own interests. So the political leadership is ideal for these landed aristocrats. And as you know, if you watch Downton Abbey, those aristocrats carried England through the whole revolutionary era, through the Industrial Revolution, right up until the first decades of the 20th century. Lord Grantham was that kind of person. He didn't work. His money came from his rents. And he was a political leader that could act in a disinterested way, an impartial way. How do you do that in America? Well, it's very difficult. And land was so readily available that you couldn't, tenantry just didn't, there were some tenants in New York, but generally speaking, tenantry couldn't work. So instead, the substitute in America was these people became bankers. George Washington was not just a planter, he was a banker. He lent money to the small farmers around him. And the same was true of people in the North. They were bankers. The elite, the ones who were wealthy, would act as bankers. Now, they're lending money out in gold and silver, and then they're suddenly getting it back in this depreciated paper. And that was one of the things that really bothered them. They felt that it was a crisis of the social order. Now, paper money, if you think about it, the state printing paper money, cuts through the patronage relationship between the big man on the hill and the ordinary farmer. He no longer had to go hat in hand and beg for a 50-pound loan so he could buy some more land or more livestock or whatever. Suddenly, he goes to an impersonal state office and borrows the money from the state, this paper. That's the significance of paper money. It seemed to strike through the social order, and it creates a frenzy among the elites. And the description of the elites, of the people who are complaining or passing the paper money, is very similar to the description that people today, elites today, in describing the Trump supporters, the MAGA supporters. The three terms I remember so well are illiberal, parochial, and narrow-minded. And you go through the Federalist Papers and you'll see that that's how they think of the people, the so-called anti-federalists, the people who are doing all of these, passing all these laws and creating a social crisis. And it seemed like a social crisis, that the world was being divided in two, and we want to be on the right side, and the side of respectability. And this is where the worthy versus the licentious comes in. Now, the anti-federalists lose the conflict over the Constitution. But I think in the end, they win the war after Jefferson's election. If you look at America in 1820, say, or 1826, when Jefferson and Adams both died, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, their dream of a world of republicanism and the res publica and the public good was as far away as you could imagine. It was the most individualistic, capitalist society. And of course, I should back up and say the Constitution, what Madison wanted in the Constitution was a veto power given to the Congress over all state laws. He thought that was the only way he could stop this kind of proliferation of bad laws and unjust legislation. Well, the idea of all the states sending in their laws to the Congress and getting them okayed was just so unworkable and so cumbersome that wiser heads in the convention prevailed, and eventually we have Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which is a prohibition on what the states can do. They can't pass tariffs, they can't negotiate treaties, but they cannot print paper money. Now, if that had been strictly enforced in the subsequent decades, the American economy would have been stifled. Now, the states get around this prohibition by chartering banks, hundreds of them, which in turn issued the paper money and flooded the country with scads, millions of dollars of paper money that became capital. It is capital. And it fed the economic bonanza. It was a risky, crazy, wildcat banking. Several states went bankrupt. The whole economic period of the antebellum period is just chaotic. By the eve of the Civil War, there were 10,000 different currencies flying around. Lots of people made a lot of money. Lots of people went out of business. It was just a wild, it was exactly the opposite of what any of the founders wanted. I mean, when you read through Jefferson or Adams's correspondence in their letters in the 1820s, they're appalled. This is not the world they wanted. Money making everywhere, risk taking, and of course they never understood what a bank was. John Adams said if paper is issued beyond the gold and silver in the vault, then it's a cheat upon someone. Well, obviously, no bank, even today, operates that way. It obviously issues more paper out than it can cover. If you've seen A Wonderful World, you know that banks can get into trouble if they issue too many promises to pay when they can't back it up. And that's the world that came out of this. So the Constitution was an attempt to deal with this commercial world that was emerging. And you might ask, and Madison's such an extraordinary mind, he comes out of the convention a little disappointed because he lost his veto. And he said, by a small majority passed it, got rid of it. But he worries about what's going to happen. But he writes to Jefferson, who's over in Paris, to tell him what went on. Jefferson, I went right by him. He didn't understand what was happening at all. But Madison said, look, you may well ask, why would this federal government be different from the state government since they're both elected? In other words, what's going to make this federal government immune from the kind of popular pressures that led to the states abusing their power? It's a very good question, and he knew it. He's the one that asked it. He says, let me tell you what. And his answer are two classics of American political theory. The first, he says, look, we're going to, contrary to Montesquieu and the best thinking of the day, we're going to expand the Republican world, the arena for politics. We're going to have an extended arena, and the competition of the various interests will negate each other. They'll never be able to cohere and commit the kind of tyranny that was being created in the states. That's his one notion. That's, I think, comes clear in Federalist 51. And then he says, at the same time, there's going to be a different kinds of people serving in the federal government. The first Congress had 65 members. I mean, that was smaller than most of the state legislatures. And the idea being, in Madison's mind, we're going to get a better sort of person elected at the federal level than we do at the state level. Sort of use the example, North Carolina had 235 people in its legislature, I think. And there are probably only 5 college graduates in the whole state of North Carolina. And it had 5 congressmen. So probably those people who had a liberal arts education, which was one of the criteria for a respectable person in I think in Madison's mind and other elites' mind, they'll be the ones in the federal government. And we'll keep the hoi polloi out. We'll keep the people who have never been to college out of government. And the that's one notion. It suggests that's why the Anti-Federalists said this is an aristocratic plot to keep us out of government. They knew what was happening. And the other was that, well, those are the two reasons. And in both cases, I think the classics of that's the 10th Federalist, essentially, which everyone agrees is probably the most interesting of the many 85 papers. Now, it didn't work out that way because William Finley, this Scotch-Irish ex-weaver from Pennsylvania, a very smart guy, never been to college, of course, but he gets into the Second Congress, and he ends up being the longest serving congressman and celebrated as such by the early 19th century. The people who represented the business world, if you will, the North. Now, the South, it's totally different in the South. The South, we can talk about that, but the South is a totally different place. And they came, in their own minds, closest to the Adam Smith image of people whose income came without exertion. In their case, the exertion of the slaves. But in a paradox, the Constitution we got didn't solve the problems that Madison was most concerned about, but it has endured for 230 some years, and I think we can anticipate, see it as the unanticipated consequences of purposive action.
Oh, can we go back to the Anti-Federalists and just talk about? So even as unlikely a pair as Madison and Hamilton in favor of this new federal constitution, two gentlemen unlike but alike in their political, their energy for sure, and their political imagination. But what about can you talk more about the Anti-Federalists and the challenge that they posed? There's a lot of subtlety there because the complex personalities come into play and their particular political interests. But the Anti-Federalists have a really good argument against what the Federalists are proposing, partly because they say the Federalists are doing kind of what you're accusing them of.
No, that's true. The Anti-Federalists, for the most part, there are a few elites, Richard Henry Lee, who end up being Anti-Federalists, but they're anomalies. The bulk of them are middle-class people.
George
But
Mason.
Melancthon Smith in New York, a petty merchant, he gives Hamilton and Robert Livingston, both college graduates, a real run in their debate over the ratification. Smith is an extraordinary, self-educated guy. The main arguments they had, one was aristocrat. This is an aristocracy. You're creating an aristocracy that's going to keep us middling people out of government. There's an element of truth to that. And you'll find Hamilton saying, what do you mean aristocracy? He says, there's no aristocracy in America. He meaning no hereditary aristocracy. But there's no doubt that Hamilton felt that he was superior to a guy like Melancthon Smith, who had never been to college. And Hamilton's a very smart guy. So he has a sense of himself, but he has to play that down. And the other issue had to do with the sovereignty, which goes back to the debate in the empire. The doctrine of sovereignty blew the whole debate apart. The idea of sovereignty was that in every state there must be one final supreme lawmaking authority. And in 1774, the Brits said, that's got to be Parliament. And the Americans said, okay, if that's true, we're not under Parliament anymore. We're just tied to the king. And that's why you get this Commonwealth notion of the empire emerging around 1774. It's sort of an anticipation of the modern Commonwealth. All the states have their own legislatures, and they tied to the king the way Canada, Australia, New Zealand are tied to the king and have independent legislatures. Sovereignty is invoked by the Anti-Federalists. If there's going to be one final supreme lawmaking authority, it's going to be the federal government because of the Supremacy Clause. And the Federalists are really stuck with this. They don't know how to handle that. And they keep trying to say, well, no, we're going to divide power. The states will have some, and these Anti-Federalists keep saying, no, we're going to have the states are going to end up laying out roads and measuring the height of fence posts, and that's all they're going to have. There's nothing important going to be left to the states. And the Federalists were desperate. And then all of a sudden, James Wilson in Philadelphia comes up with a solution. He says, we're going to relocate sovereignty in the people. Now, that doesn't just mean that all power comes from the people. He's saying that the final lawmaking, supreme lawmaking authority resides in the people. And all of these agents are the people's agents. And everyone is a representative of the people. Now, that's an extraordinary jump. Now, the way it was prepared for that in various ways through the polemics over this decade. For example, in Pennsylvania, many people, especially elites, didn't like this Pennsylvania Constitution. They had no Senate and no governor. So immediately they form arguments and make proposals to have a Senate created. Well, the opponents, that is the people who had created the original Constitution, said, oh, you're trying to foist a House of Lords on us. Very powerful argument, because who wants another House of Lords? And the people who wanted a Senate say, oh, no, we're not trying to get a House of Lords. We just want another representation of the people. Wow. Suddenly you're going to have the people represented twice? And once you start thinking like that the people can be represented in different bodies, a whole new world opens up. And that, by the time you get to the 1787, people are talking in those terms. The notion of estates of the realm or social entities competing with one another, three, the monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, which is the way John Adams thought. Suddenly you have a world in which all of the people, all of the representatives, all of the offices, including governors and senators, are considered to be agents of the people, representatives of the people. Even though we're left with this awkward notion of the House of Representatives, we now consider our senators to be just as representative, at the state and federal level. And the same was true of governors. In fact, Hamilton, if you read Federalist 78, it's interesting. This is how ideas can get you into trouble if you use them. They're arguing over. He's arguing with a New Yorker, probably Brutus, who said the judges cannot set aside any kind of statement or legislation by the representatives of the people. And Hamilton asked, he's kind of groping towards judicial review. And he says, well, who do these representatives in the legislature think they are? They're just agents of the people. But so aren't the judges, he says. They're agents of the people too. Well, you make that kind of argument, the next thing you know, somebody says, well, if the judges are agents of the people, maybe we should elect them. And sure enough, within a few years, you start having proposals to elect judges. As we know now, 39 states elect their judges. Fortunately, the East Coast, the original 13, don't adopt that. Rhode Island still has the same tenure for judges as the federal government. But that's how you get into, that's how ideas lead to things. And certainly what happens by 1787, 88 in the ratification debates, it's an extraordinary debate. And it's all been collected. You can all read it. There's about 25 now, or maybe 27 letterpress volumes in which John Kaminsky and a bunch of other people working out of the Wisconsin Historical Society have collected everything they could find on the debate over the Constitution. And it's just such a rich body of, but not many people are working on it these days because there are other issues that they're concerned with. But it's an extraordinary debate. And what the Federalists were forced to do was to argue that they were the real supporters of Republican government, that they were supporting popular government, and the Anti-Federalists were lost the debate because they, in a sense, even though they were the ordinary people, the elite had turned the whole argument into we're supporting the most popular government that ever existed. Everyone in the government is an agent of the people, a representative of the people. And from that moment on, the whole notion of discussing politics the way Aristotle did, estates, social blocks, maneuvering was gone, and we were into a modern notion of discussing politics with different interests competing with one another and parties. Hamilton and Madison, which go back to your question, it's interesting. They're both nationalists. They write the bulk of the 85 papers, Federalist Papers, but they had a very different image of what the government was going to be, and that's why Madison goes into opposition once he realizes what Hamilton has in mind in the Washington administration. Hamilton wants to create a fiscal military state similar to Great Britain, and he thinks it will take maybe 4 or 5 decades, and the United States will be able to take on the European states, any of them, on their own terms. Standing army, major bureaucracy, all of the attributes of a modern military state. And Madison had nothing like that in mind. And that's when he splits and goes into opposition and lies with Jefferson in opposition. Hamilton misread the future too. I'll give you one little anecdote. Washington says to him, how should I, when he's president, he said, I want to know how can I entertain people? How familiar can I be? And everyone writes, he writes to John Adams, to others, and Hamilton says to him, look, our society is too egalitarian as yet for the kind of formal court life, European court life that we should eventually get. But sooner or later, we're going to mature and become more hierarchical and more like England and France in time. So right now, it's too egalitarian. He couldn't have been more wrong. We became more egalitarian, and we have suddenly Andrew Jackson is president, much to the, Jefferson fortunately didn't live to see Jackson get to be president, but he was frightened at how many votes he got in 1824. He thought he was ill-equipped. He thought he was a Trump-like figure, coming to get to be president. The world is so complicated. No historian can ever recover that complicated world. We just do our best, and you get only a partial story. But that's history writing.
Wow. Okay. Well, that is a fantastic kind of closing comment here. I want to open this up for questions from the audience. I have many more, but I want to open this up to the audience to see if folks would like to. I see right back here, and one of my colleagues will bring you a microphone in just a minute. You have right over here in the middle.
Was there any push at any time to make the Supreme Court elected?
No, not in that period. I mean, one of the issues that I deal with is the transformation of the judiciary. The county courts in the colonial period were not just judicial bodies. They would handle taxation, welfare, a whole lot of they were lesser magistrates, with a chief magistrate being the governor. That's why someone like John Adams and others said, look, there are only really two powers in government. There's the executive and there's the legislature. Judiciary earned a role in this period, running especially after in the 90s, but already by 1787, the Federalists, they're frightened of democracy. And the judges become a means of dealing with democracy. And so the judges' role gets enhanced. And by the 90s, they're shedding their magisterial roles, no longer handling anything other than judicial decisions. And that, for the Supreme Court, that there's a couple of times when they're asked to deal with the pensions for the Revolutionary fighter, the soldiers, and they don't want to do that stuff. That's not our job. But it's part of a transformation. That story is not. I mean, I have chapters on it, but I mean, there's no good books on this. It's really a quite extraordinary thing. By the time you get to Marshall's court, he's still trying to build the court, so he's very careful. But there's no ever any suggestion, as far as I know, to elect them. That's the last thing the Federalists would want. And Jefferson didn't like the federal judiciary, because they were all Federalists. He inherited them, and he was and he didn't like Marshall at all, although Marshall was his cousin. So there's a lot of tension against the judiciary, and you have fights that go on in various states, Pennsylvania in particular. I deal with that in a later book, but the role of the judiciary is really crucial through this whole period.
Allison will bring you a microphone. Thanks, Allison.
Who do you give the most credit to for putting it all together?
Well, I think Madison is still the father of the Constitution. I mean, he's the one who created the Virginia Plan. And this Virginia Plan was the basis, is the model for the Constitution. Now, you can imagine the people who agreed to the meeting in Philadelphia in May of 1787 had no idea. Most people had no idea what this meeting was going to do. They thought they were going to add a couple of amendments to the articles. So there's a real shock when it comes out. They scrapped the articles completely. We got a whole new government. There was a real bewilderment. I mean, a real shock in the country. And so you can make a case that the poor anti-federalists or the opponents were stunned. This is just not what they want at all. The states are really being reduced in their minds to small entities. And it's no doubt that it's Madison that's crucial in this. But he needed support. People had to agree with him. And he did consult with a lot of people. And he loses several debates. He wanted proportional representation in both houses, because the idea of two senators from the state elected by the state legislature, in his mind, the states are so strong in people's minds that if you recognize the state to that extent, that allowing them to elect two senators, that this is going to vitiate the government in some way. There's the notion of this federal government, which has suddenly been created, lasting, seemed problematic to people like Madison. Can we make it? Can we get it? And I think the fact that Washington was the first president, I mean, that made all the difference, because people trusted him. And he was essential to holding the government together. And at the same time, there was great prosperity in the early 90s. Europe was at war. We were a neutral state and making money hand over fist. And so there was tremendous prosperity. That really was crucial in sustaining this federal government, which is, we take it for granted. I mean, it lasted, but it could have failed. It could have collapsed. So Washington is a crucial element in that. Jefferson is the most radical, progressive president that perhaps we've ever had. Minimal government was the radical position of the day in the English-speaking world. The government was corrupting. You want to minimize government. Government created distinctions, awarded monopolies. It did all these things. Get the government out. Someone like William Godwin is a radical. William Godwin, you probably, most people haven't heard of him, but he's the father of Mary Shelley. He married Mary Wollstonecraft. He was part of a radical circle in England. And he is the founder of anarchism, well, presumably the founder of anarchism in the English-speaking world. He believed in minimal government. If you read his stuff, it sounds like Jefferson. Government, well, Paine also says the same thing. Read the first paragraph of Common Sense. Society is benign. Government is a necessary evil at best. Social relationships are natural. They're very optimistic. If you can just get the government out of the way, people will naturally relate to one another. That's Jefferson. He really does believe that. He wants to keep the government as out of human relationships as possible. And of course, he's a Southerner, a slaveholder, and his backing, it turns out that minimal government is very satisfactory to Southern slaveholders, so that the federal government doesn't interfere with their institution. But that's not why he believes in minimal government any more than William Godwin believes in minimal. William Godwin is an Englishman and is not a slaveholder. Is just a radical. The radical position of the late 18th century is minimal government, to keep the government out, and with how to put it, a benign view of social relationships, that we're naturally harmonious, we're naturally going to get along with one another. If you just get the government out of the way and prevent us from loving one another, is essentially what the radical position was. That's where the French fraternity comes from. Their trilogy is liberty, equality, and fraternity. This was part of the radical position of the enlightened position of the late 18th century.
These two questions come from our virtual attendees. The first, and please feel free to go off of whichever one you prefer or both. The first one says, I took History 151 and 152 54 years ago, and it has taken me the next half century to fully appreciate what you tried to teach us. Would you offer your observations about the current state of the historical profession and the study of history, especially for undergraduates? And then the second virtual question is actually from historian Michael Haddam, and it says, can Gordon speak to how he sees the relationship between his two books, The Creation of the American Republic and The Radicalism of the American Revolution?
I'm not sure of the question. I couldn't quite hear it. But if you're asking about the state of the historical profession, I think that all the humanities are in some trouble. As you know from an article in the Atlantic, I think 2 years ago, only 1/10 of the graduating class at Harvard majored in the humanities. 10%. 10%. 90% were in the STEM subjects. This is, I think, what's happening. Now, I'm not sure that it's happening at Brown. I think Brown's history department is doing very well in history majors, but there is obviously a crisis of some sort taking place in higher education, because the costs have become so great, and parents simply want, and the kids think in terms of making money right away. I mean, it used to be, I think you could major in history or classics and go to work for Goldman Sachs, and they'd train you to be a financier. But now you want to get that in the college itself, and Brown now has a Center for Entrepreneurial Studies. I couldn't imagine that happening at a liberal arts education institution. But that's the way of what's happening. So there are real changes taking place. How they'll all play out. I mean, the costs keep going up. It'll be $100,000 a year at the major institutions pretty soon, and I don't know how that's going to play out. But anyway, things are changing. Now, I'm not sure I answered your question because I couldn't quite hear it.
I know the second question came online from Michael Haddam, the historian who's just written about.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and Michael asks, could you talk about the relationship between creation of the American Republic and radicalism of the American Revolution?
Okay.
So these are interesting books in a whole variety of ways, including that you back up your chronology.
Right. Radicalism deals with a lot of problems that I hadn't dealt with in the creation, especially republicanism. I treat republicanism as if it were a kind of marginal group of people who are radicals on the outside, taking over, replacing monarchy. As I did more reading, I came to realize that republicanism, by the end of the 18th century in the English-speaking world in particular, but also in France, had seeped in and was coloring and mingling with monarchism, so that monarchy was already half republicanized. People were, Lord Chesterfield liked to think that he was where it is positioned because of his merit. He didn't like to think that he was there because of his inheritance. The whole notion of patrimony was in question. And although they weren't ready to execute the king in England, they certainly were thinking in enlightened terms. And all men are created equal. That most powerful 5 words in the Declaration of Independence. What did it mean? For enlightened people, it meant that, and this is extraordinary when you think about it, that we're all born with a blank slate. Everyone. And Jefferson didn't agree, but everyone else did. And William Byrd and aristocrat, slaveholder, he said, look, race doesn't matter, none of this matters. We're all born the same. What makes a difference is the experience and the circumstances of our upbringing. That is, it's nurture, not nature. All nurture. That's what it means to say all men are created equal. It's a Lockean epistemology with this notion that the experiences you go through life create the distinctions that emerge. And this means that if you could change people's environments, you could change them. They don't have to be. The inevitability of even slaves. They actually use the climate, of course, becomes part of that environment. And many people in America argue that the slaves were black because skin had been scorched by the African sun. And David Ramsey writes to Jefferson and says, I think they're going to whiten in the more temperate climate of North America. And he says, already I think they're more white in Jersey than they are in Carolina. But that's how powerful they thought the environment was. But not just the physical environment, the social environment, the cultural environment. We're going to change that. Well, once you think like that, and this is not the Ancien regime. They were all nature, not nurture. People are born to be what they are, and there's not much you can do about it. Therefore, there's not much concern for the lowly. You give them money, you charity, but you don't expect to change them. All of a sudden, you have a responsibility for the moral responsibility for the downtrodden in the society. And education becomes crucial. And that's why all of the founders become obsessed by education. We're going to change people. This is the Enlightenment. Jefferson wasn't original when he said all men are created equal. It was a conventional wisdom among enlightened people. And suddenly, if you see people who are downtrodden and slaves, you say, we have a moral responsibility now. We can do something. And for the first time in history, you have an anti-slave movement. You have humanitarian organizations in the 18th century. No one in medieval times thought in terms of changing the world. This is what Thomas Paine means when he says we have the world, the chance to make the world over again. There's a real excitement about that comes out of the Enlightenment. People really, but also the moral responsibility for the poor and the downtrodden, and which we've inherited. And anti-slavery, slavery had existed for thousands of years without any substantial criticism. All of a sudden, in the late 18th century, coinciding with the American Revolution, it gets criticized, and something was done about it in America. The northern states are the first states in the history of the world, the modern world at least, to abolish slavery where it had legally existed. And 8 states do that. Now, the South doesn't do that, but they are thrown on the defensive. Those slaveholders are thrown on the defensive for the first times in their lives. And they have to defend the institution in a way they never had to before. So it's a major, this is a great moment in world history, or at least in Western history. And America was right at the heart of it. The American Revolution's first convention, anti-slavery convention in the history of the world, is held in Philadelphia in 1776. That's not coincidental.
Can I ask you one last very quick question?
Sure.
This has to do with the point about historicism. You said just a few minutes ago that people are complex, societies are complex, histories are so complicated that the best we can do is try to understand these complex pasts. How can we think about the value of that past for us now, knowing how complex our own world is, knowing how complex that world is? How do we make any kind of connection?
Well, I just think the reality is so complicated that historians can never fully recover it. But of course, I always used to ask my students, who knows more about the past? Us today, 200 years later, or the people who lived back then? Well, in some sense, of course, we'll never recover the intimacy of their lives. But we know more about what's happening to them because we know how it all turned out. So we're in a position to write about their history in a way they could not write about themselves. We can't tell what's going to happen to us. We can't write our own history because we just don't know any more than they knew. Hamilton had no idea that he was having that Jackson would emerge, and Jacksonian America and democracy of that sort. So the people living through events are the least capable of understanding what's happening. The historian has that advantage. But we'll never really recover the full. I mean, that's just understandable. The life is just so complicated. But we make efforts to figure out what's happening. I mean, I always used to tell my students, because there's the real danger, and I think one of the things that's afflicted present history writing is anachronism. Going back and judging the people in the past by our standards and condemning them for not being like us. It sounds, but there's a wonderful epigraph in L.P. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between, a wonderful novel, great movie too, where he says, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And when you tell that to the students, then they understand it differently. They realize that it would be so unsophisticated to go to France and Italy and complain that the Italians weren't behaving like us. That would just seem so silly. But the same thing is true if you go back into the past and find that those people don't think like us. Then you've got the first step toward historical consciousness, or historical understanding. And I found that comparing it to a foreign country was more useful. And students grasp that more quickly than they could if you tried to tell them that, well, it's different back there. So that's the first step in teaching history, is to get the kids to realize that the world back there is different from us. And history, historical reconstruction, is to go back there and then say, how did that world so different from ours come to be us? And that's historical writing.
Thank you, Gordon.